Hi everyone, my name is Stephen Stewart. I am very pleased and excited to introduce Baselode Energy to everyone. This is something our group has been working on for a long time, and it's very timely given what's been going on in the uranium space. It's actually very exciting. We've been waiting for it. We had no idea it was coming this quickly or how it was going to come, but it might be here. It might not be, but we think it is. And so Baselode is our new vehicle. It's led by a gentleman by the name of James Sykes. He's got a track record, an excellent track record. I think he is the guy to back in the Athabasca, and that's why our team has got involved with it. There's lots going on in uranium, and there are new types of deposits within the basin that we think are just unparalleled. NexGen would be a perfect example of it, and James Sykes was one of the gentlemen responsible, largely responsible for the discovery of the Arrow deposit, which is a disruptor. It's a game changer in terms of profitability, so the grade as well as the operating costs. And before we get into what Baselode is and how we are going to capitalize on the cycle, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we view the energy space and what we've cheekily named the white lies about green energy and the truth on uranium. There's a big narrative, and I'll get into it, but here's the forward-looking statement. And what this is ultimately going to say is, look, this is our opinions and how we are going to capitalize on what we see as inefficiencies and misinformation within the uranium and the general energy markets. So here's a little bit about the agenda. We're going to tell you what is Baselode. We call ourselves Baselode, L-O-D-E. Obviously, Baselode, L-O-A-D, has a completely different spelling, but what it means is the minimum amount of energy you need in order to maintain the grid, our way of life, put it that way. We're going to talk about the misinformation within the green energy revolution. We certainly see that as a positive. Green energy is a good thing. Renewables are a good thing. But the truth is they just do not meet our base load energy requirements. Plain and simple, end of story. So the bottom line is it's uranium or it's fossil fuels. So take your choice. Next, we're going to talk about disequilibrium in the uranium space, meaning how the uranium market has effectively been broken ever since Fukushima and why. Then we're going to talk about uranium's place in the energy mix, how important it is to our standard of life and our future as we grow. And then we'll talk about the pricing, supply, and demand of uranium. And then we'll talk a little bit about the Athabasca Basin. Long story short, it is in Canada. It's the best jurisdiction in the world. But beyond that, the Athabasca Basin has grades of uranium that are just unparalleled. We'll talk more about that. Then we'll talk about Baselode CEO James Sykes. He's a gentleman who has disrupted. He's been involved with NexGen, and they disrupted the uranium market. That's how we view it, and it's a different way of thinking, and what we define as Athabasca 1.0, which are all the other deposits in the basin, and those typically have water issues, and those are typically called unconformity deposits, whereas the Athabasca 2.0, which Baselode will be focused on, are considered basement hosted, and I'll get into those in a minute. And then I'll talk about Baselode itself, the corporation, and our place in the uranium mix. So here we go. So this is Baselode. This is just our little diagram here defining what the term energy baseload, L-O-A-D, means. You simply cannot rely on renewable energy because it's intermittent. Okay, so everybody knows the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't always blow, but it also doesn't have the capacity to meet the underlying demands of a city. First of all, if you want to talk about commercial or industrial demand, forget about it. So baseload really refers to the minimum power demand, the baseline or the base load, and uranium, fossil fuels, and hydro meet those. Solar and wind simply just don't have the ability, one because of intermittency, and the other is because of energy density. There's just not enough of it. So who is Baselode? Well, Baselode is, we're brand new, we're cheap, We have great people. We're led by James, and we have our team here in Toronto focused on putting this opportunity together, financing it, marketing it, moving it forward, with James in Saskatoon focused on discovery. Again, the discovery, what are we looking for? We're looking for basement hosted deposits, just like the Arrow and the NexGen, which, the grades are, as I said, are phenomenal, and the extraction costs are low, which means high margin. In a cyclical commodity like uranium, or like most commodities, it's the high margin projects that win. And so when we started Baselode, we really started it because of two fundamental reasons, and we came to a conclusion. And it was, I guess, my counter-cyclical nature. Being in the commodities business for a long time, we look for counter-cyclical opportunities, and uranium has been hated for so long, I started to love it. But just because it's hated doesn't mean you're supposed to love it. That's not an investment proposition. You have to dig deeper. You don't just love it for the sake of it. And so, but it did form a thesis, and we asked ourselves why, and we quickly found out that the market is in disequilibrium. And what do I mean by that? Well, uranium prices, for simplistic purposes, have been hovering around $20 for a long, long, long time. However, the cost to produce that virtually anywhere in the world is vastly higher than that. And in terms of building new deposits, call it the incentive price for new mines to come online, you need $50, $60 minimum for most of these deposits. I wouldn't classify basement hosted deposits quite like that. They have much lower cost, however, everywhere else in the world. And so we came to the simple conclusion, beyond the disequilibrium of the pricing, and taking the bet that uranium price has to go up. The only question is when. And we also came to the conclusion that uranium is not going anywhere. Okay, so there's a lot of talk about solar and wind, and as I said off the top, those are great things, and we hope that those improve and efficiencies. However, when you take a step back and you look at the reality, the truth is they just don't meet our, not just our baseload demands, but they just don't meet our demands for realistic living in the urban environment or industrial commercial usage. So the equation today and for the foreseeable future is very simple. You have to make a choice. If you want to maintain our lifestyle, it's fossil fuels or nuclear. And everybody knows fossil fuel means carbon, and certainly the very strong narrative around the world is an anti-carbon footprint. Whether you believe that or not, that's not important, but what the policy is going towards is against carbon. And guess what? Nuclear has a zero carbon footprint, at least in terms of utilizing it. Yeah, sure, there's carbon footprint in terms of building the plant, but that's not important. It's the ongoing footprint of nuclear, and it is clean, it's efficient, it's abundant, and the technology is there, and it's only gotten better. So very briefly, I won't get into this. There's all sorts of debates around this, but really what it is there's a lot of misinformation about wind and solar, and biomass. We'll include biomass as a renewable energy. But wind is great, but if the wind doesn't always blow, and there's all sorts of controversy around the birds and everywhere. Well, the truth is, in order to produce energy, you need a trade-off. And some birds, unfortunately, may meet their demise with a windmill and so on and so forth. And for solars, there's also all sorts of considerations in terms of their lifespan, degradation. What in fact are they made of? Well, they burn an awful lot of carbon, coal, in fact, to make these solar panels. And largely the market's controlled out of China, which creates other issues. And then there's biomass, which is just a fancy word for burning wood, which to me sort of seems like we're going back 100 years. And I think there's probably a better way. And yes, that's supposedly sustainable because you can always, grow more trees. However, trees take 20, 30 years to grow. And so I just don't think that's really a truly viable way to produce energy on a global scale. And then, of course, in order to battle the intermittent effects of wind, solar, etc., we have storage. And because you can't always, you have to have it on demand, and so you store it in batteries. And And yes, everybody knows that the EV revolution is here, and that's a great thing. And I think that's growing. And the batteries for the EVs, while still are not on cost parity with internal combustions, they're getting close. But they're completely different technology and scale required when you're talking about grid storage. And the battery grid storage, plain and simple, it's not there. It's just not there. There's great ideas and we're working towards it, but today it's not there. And there's capacity issues. So the bottom line, and again, in our opinion on renewables, they are inefficient, they are intermittent, and there's just not a sufficient supply. So what's the alternative? Well, the alternative traditionally has been, we've got hydro, that's great. It also has problems in terms of you have to move communities. As I said, there's trade-offs. You've got fossil fuels. The Earth has been burning fossil fuels for 150, maybe more, in terms of on an industrial scale. Apparently, there are serious issues with releasing carbon dioxide into the environment. And of course, we've had nuclear ever since the nuclear came into effect in around the 50s and the 60s and started to take off since then, but it's pulled back. But why? There's a lot of information about uranium as well. And I think you can go back to, obviously, when everybody thinks uranium, they think nuclear. And the perception is, terrible things like Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which of course happened in 1945 in August. And those were terrible disasters here, but they ended the war. We're not here to discuss that, but that's part of the perception is people being blown up when they think of uranium. And then, of course, you have other types of tragedies, nuclear tragedies, when you talk about Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, Fukushima. Well, let's break those down a little bit. Chernobyl, first of all, was built on 1950s, 60s technologies. It's 50, 60 years old, and it was a terrible tragedy. I believe about 20 to 30 people died directly. Most of those were first responders. Obviously terrible heroes who risked their lives to go in there and put the quote unquote fire out. There is great debate around how many people died from the fallout. I say the high end numbers I've read are in the thousands. Terrible. 3 Mile Island was another one that happened in the US, and I think that really turned off Americans to the nuclear idea. Truth is, nobody died at 3 Mile Island, not a single person. Fukushima, I've read one, maybe two people died at Fukushima. So again, one life is too much. But as I said before, energy production, our way of life requires trade-offs, whether that's getting in an airplane or getting in your car or producing energy. There are negative effects and sometimes people die. But let's talk about fossil fuel, which is the predominant energy production mechanism. I don't know what the right numbers are, but I've heard 700,000 people a year to 1 million people a year die from coal. Okay, so that's the effluent that goes into the air, into the water, and while people don't necessarily, that many people die at the plant, but it's about the consequences of burning fossil fuels. And so when we step back and we evaluate how many people have died from uranium energy production, which, let's just say, directly is definitely less than 100, indirectly potential a couple thousand versus 1 million people a year. And fossil fuels, again, we go back to the choice. If we're gonna maintain our life, energy production lifestyle between fossil fuels, which kills 1 million people a year, or nuclear, which in total in history has killed maybe 2,000. I think the truth becomes quite clear, but you have to look at it rationally. You have to look at it. You have to remove the emotional aspects out of it and realize the truth. Uranium, nuclear production energy is safe. There's no carbon footprint. It's efficient. The fuel, which is uranium, is abundant. And last, new technologies. So Chernobyl, that was ancient technology. We have new designs for nuclear power plants, which are in the pipeline. And if you watch and listen to Bill Gates' documentary, he's got a design, he's backed a group, Terra Nova, that has a nuclear power plant that shuts down or does not burn out, or sorry, does not explode. So the worst case scenario is that it just shuts down. And so these are new technologies that require investment, but add to the argument that nuclear energy is the safest form of energy production. Okay, so let's talk about uranium price disequilibrium. What do I mean by that? So McArthur River is in the Athabasca Basin. It is what we call a Athabasca 1.0. It's super high grade, incredibly rich rock on a per ton basis, great margins when uranium price is decent. It is owned by Cameco. Cameco is a Canadian publicly traded company in the Toronto Venture Exchange. Why do I talk about McArthur River? Well, before COVID, before everybody shut down, 65% of supply was shut down in the last month. They took McArthur River offline. McArthur River is the highest grade uranium deposit in the world, in Canada. They took it offline. Why? Because they were losing money. If they can't make money on the highest grade uranium deposit in the world, in the best jurisdiction in the world, the uranium market is broken. That's what I mean by disequilibrium. So what was Cameco doing? And I'll talk about, the spot versus contract pricing. So Cameco has term contracts with end users who are typically utility companies. And so instead of producing their own uranium out of McArthur River, the highest grade uranium deposit in the world, they shut it down, put it on care and maintenance, and decided to buy uranium out of the spot market, meaning from other people. And that is just there's a lot of reasons for that, of course, but all in all, that's pretty crazy. And so what were utilities doing? Well, utilities weren't really, I think utilities probably would be very happy to lock in long-term prices at $20. But the bottom line is these producers just are absolutely unwilling to sign long-term contracts at $20 or $25 or even $30 per pound because they're losing money. It's just an unsustainable price. That's what I mean by disequilibrium. And so what's been happening? How are people been using uranium in the meantime? Well, they've been drawing down their inventories. Typically, utilities and countries keep strategic inventories, reserves. There was, 5-6 years ago, there was the Russians decommissioned the nuclear warheads, and that was a source of supply. So stuff like that has been happening. However, that is coming to an end. There's only so many above ground pounds of uranium available, and they've been drawing it down. And in addition to that, we're going to show you a chart here in the next that shows that these term contracts are coming off. And so that means these end users, the utilities, are going to be sourcing for new supply, and it's happening pretty quickly. So this chart here, we sourced it from somewhere else, but it starts from 2020, and in the dark blue here is where you see the uncovered demand coming due. So these are the contracts, and we can see they're coming off. And this chart shows here by 2025, about 37% of demand will be uncovered, and it's quickly growing to 55% in about 6 years from now. Now that's not a tomorrow thing, but you've got to keep in mind that, two things. One is these contracts are negotiated well in advance, and two, these utilities are people like you and I. They have fear of missing out, and that is what is going to ultimately drive supply. So as this price is creeping up, and in the last few weeks, uranium's gone into the 30s, so that's getting people's attention, and they see that their contracts are coming up. So people are going to start to flood into the market and sign these contracts, and that's going to create a shrinking supply and increased demand. And we're going to see that play out in the spot market. We're going to see that play out in the long-term contracts. And this is just a quick segue into how uranium is priced. And there are really two mechanisms. But the truth is there's a lot of, what's the right word? I guess misinformation. Again, the spot market is just not accurate. It's not a true price discovery like, I would say how the LME has been operating, or maybe the COMEX. However, the derivative aspects of that has really driven even gold and oil into what is the true price. But I won't get into that discussion. But nonetheless, the spot price of the uranium, it's not true price discovery. There's a lot of speculation that goes into this. People who are traders who don't take physical delivery. And so, as an example, sometimes oil goes to negative $37. Well, that's not inaccurate. That's not price discovery. Similar sorts of things are happening in the uranium market, although it's a little more nuanced. And then the second part of the uranium pricing mechanism are contracts. These are private contracts between Cameco and a utility, an end user, whoever was legally allowed to purchase uranium. Again, there's confidentiality issues here. The reported prices are not necessarily accurate, so there's no true price discovery. There's a lot of misinformation, but that's how the market is. It's either the spot price, as I mentioned. Cameco shut down production. They've been sourcing. They've been satisfying their long-term contracts by buying it from the spot as opposed to producing it. And then you've got these long-term contracts, private contracts, which I believe are the majority of the market and are coming off due, and there's going to be demand for longer term contracts. But I believe me that the Cameco and everybody who produces uranium is absolutely going to refuse to commit to long-term prices if it's not profitable, because that means the end of their business. So let's talk about COVID, and this is ultimately what has driven the, call it, excitement in the uranium price and the uranium equities over the past 2 or 3 weeks. This is the end of April, I'm speaking this, but as of today, 65%, as per this TD Securities research report, 65% of uranium production has come offline. We see Cigar Lake, some operations in Namibia, Australia, and Kazakhstan. Kazatomprom shut down their operations. So that is significant, and that's what has just driven the price from $24 up to $32. At least that's what we're seeing in the spot price. So that's a significant shock, and I'll be honest with you, I didn't expect this to happen. When I found out about COVID, I thought this would be negative towards our efforts in Baselode to launch Baselode. However, we were wrong, because I guess we just didn't anticipate the supply coming offline. And I think it's important to note that it's clearly this, between 5 mines right here, that's 65% of production. So what does that tell you? That it's a unique market. There's very, very few mines that actually produce and feed the market. There's very, very few economic, certainly a spot price economic deposits waiting in the pipeline to be brought online. And there are very few uranium exploration companies, because ever since Fukushima 10 years ago, the market has been dead as a doornail. And so only the strongest survived. And of course, within that time frame, we had this new type of deposit that NexGen and the Arrow discovered, which is game changing, and it'll have impacts going forward. But that's a short-term situation. I don't know. I mean, I guess the moral of the story here is COVID and supply shutdowns going to be the catalyst to spark a true increase to a sustainable level in uranium price? It might not be. This might be a false start. So maybe in a month's time, the mines open back up and supply comes down and uranium price goes back down. That's possible. I don't know. However, there is a catalyst ahead. Uranium price has to go up. It sort of looks like this is going to be one of the catalysts, if not the catalyst. Another potential catalyst is they call Section 232, or the Nuclear Fuel Working Group. This is brought on by President Trump, and this has substantial supply and demand implications. Last week, after much delay and anticipation, they actually brought out the details, although they brought out that the details were a little thin. But what I can tell you, at least my opinion, is that this marks a fundamental shift in U.S. policy. And what does that really mean? Well, obviously, uranium is a strategic metal from a defense, but also from an energy production standpoint. But the U.S. has dropped the ball, and they've let production go to, I think they do 1% of uranium production. And they've been importing it from Russia, from us, from potentially unfriendly sources. And in light of COVID, and in light of really a new world and how we're going to gain control of our supply chains and look towards friendlier resource nations, this Section 232, and what does it say? Well, it says the U.S. is going to buy $150 million worth of uranium every year for the next 10 years. It says it's going to effectively refuse or seriously limit refined product coming in from Russia or China. But perhaps most importantly, this is a shift in fundamental policy about the building of nuclear power plants. And so what would that do? That would increase the demand coming out of the US for product. And so I really think this has both demand and supply implications. However, my warning is this: I think this is great for the short term, and maybe this is really lights the fire, especially given the COVID supply shutdown issues. However, the bottom line is this: choose your partners very carefully. And in this instance, it would be the government. And as we know, or if you don't, take note, governments change in their composition quickly. There's an election in November. Even if Mr. Trump is elected in November of this year, their attitudes and policy can also change very quickly. So do not bet the farm on partnerships with the government. However, the uranium market should take this as certainly as a short-term positive, but medium to long-term, buyer beware. So the price catalysts, again, we make the argument it's just unsustainable at $20, $30, $40. It's broken, it has to fix. So we are saying uranium price is going to go up beyond that to 50, 60. The high was 137 in the last cycle. That's again, that would be an unsustainably high price. However, so what are some other things that could happen? Japan, obviously, big accident in Fukushima. That was about 10 years ago. And Japan committed to take off their uranium reactors. They have about 34. They brought back 9. And Japan is in a unique situation where it doesn't have a lot of natural resources, and so uranium is really a natural fit, despite obviously the Hiroshima and Nagasaki aspects of it. But it's a natural fit because it's a small island, lots of high density, high energy usage, and uranium fits perfectly. And they're a very pragmatic country. So I do think that Japan, because of the alternatives, which are clearly only fossil fuel to meet their demand, they will slowly but surely bring back maybe all 34, maybe more, maybe they'll start building them in time. So that would be a catalyst. We talked about Section 232. The US isn't the only one that's going to take this approach. I think in light of COVID, in a new world, we're going to see nationalistic policies. All countries will be looking to supply their manufacturing of energy production, as well as if they're fortunate enough to have uranium, you will see inward policies like that. So that's a catalyst. Contracts, definitely 2021, there will be buyers. There's no choice. And then the supply uncertainty, we talked about that. And then I'll talk about the rise, the last catalyst could be the rise in fossil fuel usage. With oil price coming down, I think we're going to see a lot more burning of natural gas and fuel oil. And that does not jive with call it the green policy to reduce carbon policy. So as we see, as the world comes to realize the two choices, fossil fuels and nuclear, and fossil fuels is cheap, we'll probably see more friendly policy towards clean burning energy. It's not burning actually, but clean energy, and that's nuclear and obviously uranium demand. Okay, so shifting towards the Athabasca Basin and why we think, and many people think, this is the best place in the world to look for uranium. First and foremost, it is in Canada. And Canada is my home. Pretty much the only place we do business because it's safe and it's blessed with a huge endowment of mineral resources. And then this is in Saskatchewan. The Athabasca Basin is in the north of Saskatchewan. It covers a little bit into the eastern part of Alberta, but where all the uranium is typically in Saskatchewan. And Saskatchewan, potash uranium, one of the best mining jurisdictions in Canada. It has 20% of the world's uranium supply, and it's high grade. Okay, so the average grade of uranium is something like 0.2 in worldwide, but the average grade in the Athabasca is nearly 4. You see U3O8, that's the yellow cake product. But in terms of not everybody appreciates, knows how to price that properly. So let's put that in gold equivalent terms. So 4% yellow cake is nearly 90 grams per ton in gold. That is Has very, very rich rock. That's 4 times the grade of Kirkland Lake Gold's Macassa mine, which is the highest grade gold mine in the world. There's a lot of mines that operate at sub 1 gram in the gold world. Well, here in the Athabasca, the average grade is 90 grams, almost 90 grams gold per ton. So you just get, not only are you in a safe jurisdiction, you're not operating in Africa or Kazakhstan, you're operating in Canada, in a very safe and mining-friendly jurisdiction called Saskatchewan, and you get the highest revenue per ton deposits in the world. So why would you go anywhere else? I don't know. I wouldn't. When it comes to uranium, this is where you want to be. And this is a little snippet of the Athabasca Basin, and you've got the east side here, where there's great infrastructure, mills, roads, etc. You've got a little bit over on the west side where you've got, I'll point it here, Arrow, this is NexGen, and then you've got Fission over there as well. But the Eastern Basin, that's where we're going to focus, because we do see these basement hosted deposits here. We have a different way of looking for uranium in the basin. Guys like James Sykes, when they found Arrow, they weren't looking for your typical deposits. They had a different approach, a different thesis, and that's the thesis that we're taking with Baselode. And we're going to look here on the east side of the basin for new deposits in areas of great infrastructure. So let's talk a little bit about what we mean Athabasca 2.0 versus 1.0. So the Athabasca Basin has been around for a long time. These grades have been known, however, and there's lots of deposits that have been found. And I don't know if I'd call them deposits, but a lot of resources that have been found. The vast majority of them are uneconomic. There's only 2 or 3 that are in operation right now. But there's lots of deposits. But what's the problem? And I call all these deposits Athabasca 1.0, and they're unconformity deposits. And an unconformity in geology is when you really have 2 different types of rocks sitting on top of the other. And what the issue here, particularly in the basin, is water. I'm going to keep this is very, very simplistic analysis here, but the problem with these deposits is water, and the basin is wet, and you've got the sandstone. And so what I always use as an example as to why these unconformity deposits are so difficult is Cigar Lake. And so Cigar Lake, like McArthur River, it's owned by Cameco and others, but mostly Cameco is the operator. What they've had to do here is super high grade deposit. I think it's 17%, which is just, I said the average grade was 4%, which is about 90 grams per ton gold. This Cigar Lake and McArthur River are in the high teens, okay? And so that's how rich that rock is. However, they flood. And what Cameco has to do in Cigar Lake is freeze the rock. And take my word for it, that's expensive. So these are deep, wet, very complicated, very expensive CapEx, very expensive OpEx. So that's the problem with 1.0. But then the 2.0, and I define NexGen and their Arrow, which I own a piece of myself personally, and so buyer beware. But it really is a new style of deposit. It's much simpler geology. It's competent rocks near surface. And you get these great margins. And this is again, I borrowed this from NexGen. I'm not sure if they're the originator, but this shows the difference. And so these are typical unconformity deposits here. Cigar Lake, I referenced this here. So it's it's not that well. It's deep, but not too deep. Very rich deposit. But the problem is here. You see, this is the unconformity here is along this trend here, and this is where they sit. Whereas you get the Arrow deposit, and this sort of is almost like a cigar. Well, no pun intended on Cigar Lake there, but that's kind of what they are. And they don't have these water issues. And so you can mine, and again, vertical is nice to mine. You want to use gravity, and these are conventional mining methods, which makes it nice. And so these are the types of deposits which we think are Athabasca 2.0. This is what you want. We think if you can find deposits of these comparable grades and not have to deal with these hugely expensive water issues, well, that's the future of the uranium mining. I've already mentioned the Arrow, which I think is just a phenomenal deposit, and the people there is great people. Of course, James Sykes was part of that, but again, I referenced them, almost 18%. The average grade is 4%. The high grade zone in the Arrow, which is also high grade, but also huge, is 18%. And so that is 400 grams per ton. Fantastic. It's an unparalleled deposit, but it required different thinking. So they came in there and they had a different thesis, because to find a deposit like this with a drill bit requires a different thesis and requires it to be drilled differently. And this is why I sought out James Sykes, because he is largely credited with the deposit. He was involved with, before his success with NexGen, he was with Hathor and their Rough Rider deposit, which was acquired by Rio Tinto. And he was also involved with Denison. Of course, Denison is a famous uranium company with a great history. And so James has really cut his teeth in the basin. He lives in Saskatoon. He was born in Elliott Lake, Ontario, which was, go back far enough, that's where uranium was mined in Ontario. However, those deposits are simply uneconomic with the discovery of the Athabasca, particularly Athabasca 2.0. So James is the mastermind behind Baselode, and effectively what our group has done, and for those who know us, we are very much involved in the resource business, and we have a very competent management team, finance, marketing, compliance, CFO, etc. And we seek out opportunities, and we look for counter-cyclical plays like uranium, and then we look for people who've had success, and we look to back them. And this is exactly what's happening with James Sykes. Ask anybody who knows anything about the basin, and they will know James Sykes. Listen to the podcasts. People talk about James Sykes. He lives and breathes it. He's young and he's hungry, and this is his vehicle to go out and find a new Athabasca 2.0 discovery. And this is early days, and so we're quite excited about it. Beyond James, I talked about James, and I guess people is the most important thing. And so, why Baselode? Again, it's because we're new, we're cheap, we've got great people, we've got tight share structure, we've got 22 million shares outstanding, only 4 million in the float. So, and the balance, the 18 million are tied up for 3 years. We are raising money as part of a qualifying transaction. Again, we're cheap. We're looking for basement-hosted deposits in the Athabasca Basin, like NexGen. It's early days, so it's exploration. There's high risk, but we've got a great team. We've got a great shot. We've got a specific view on what we're looking for and how to find it. And this could be the run of a very aggressive run in the uranium price, which we have absolutely no control over, but we know is happening, but we don't know if it's happening in 2020 or 2021 or beyond. But it could be happening today. And if we combine the prospects of great people looking for a new disruptive type of deposit and a strong uranium market, well, that could be very interesting. So I'll leave it there. Again, my name is Stephen Stewart. I'm the chairman. You can reach me at these contacts here if you have any interest in learning more about Baselode, its financing, or anything else to do with the company. Thank you.